Let's continue with our journey through this book, The Joy of the Cross. Did Jesus get his joy? And we've not got very far because we're only on Genesis chapter 3 verse 15 and we're looking at the falls. The next 3 videos will be about the falls, the 3 falls. And hopefully that sparks your curiosity, because you may be thinking, I only know about one fall, and that's the fall of Adam and Eve. Adam and Adam. I'll tell you why I needed to correct myself there. So we're moving on in our journey. We've got the perfect Adam, is planted in the perfect garden, fellowships with God every day, and is on an intimate level, which some of us haven't got there yet, and some of us have got there to some degree. But I suspect that none of us have got back to the degree that Adam had with God in the beginning. But we're striving towards that. So they were given one commandment, not to eat the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Some theologians have described this as the state of innocence. If you follow in the dispensational teaching, you will see that that is talked about in that scheme of teachings. Whoops, getting all confused with stuff here. Yet despite them having a perfect environment, fellowship with God on an intimate level, they still were questioned by some other supernatural being within the garden. And that's one point that I want to bring out, that I think I mentioned it in one of the other videos, that Eve had no issue with talking to another supernatural being. It wasn't another human. And this being started to question her identity. And let me tell you, that is the same tactic that the enemy uses today. He questions a believer's identity, and we start to think, am I really saved? Am I really all that God talks about me and says I am in the Bible? And he's using the same tactic on us today as he did back in the garden with Eve. Question their identity and question the calling that they had. And he gave this female Adam what seemed to be a plausible explanation of how to increase her spirituality. It's interesting, theologians tell us that the both Adams were there at the same time. So the male Adam had been given the direction not to eat from this tree, and he had relayed that to the female Adam when she came along. And so she's got her instructions firsthand, but he stood alongside her while this supernatural being is talking to them. And she has a desire in her heart to be more spiritual than she had at that point in time, because she forgot who she was. And that's what she says later on in Genesis when God said, what have you done? So this supernatural being is referred to as the Satan, or Satan in our modern translations. And he was actually a throne guardian. He was a cherubim in his own rights. He was a beautiful being, but he's not a beautiful being anymore. And the word Satan is really at this time, this translation that we've got is a combination of Ha-Satan, which means the Satan, the accuser, not a personal name like Julie or Tom or Dick. We wouldn't use that, the Julie, in context talking about me and who I am. And so the grammar around the word in here is Ha-Satan, the Satan, the accuser. And we see that come out again in the book of Job. So we have the fall depicted here, and the 2 images are cast out of the garden. And God instructs a cherubim with a flaming sword, a throne guardian, to stand guard over the entrance to the tree of life. A cherubim is not some chubby baby that we see depicted around Christmas and arts and cathedrals and stuff. He was a throne guardian, and he's probably quite tall and probably quite fierce looking. Interesting that the tree of life wasn't forbidden to them. They could have taken from the tree of life at any time, but they didn't. But in their current state that they were now, where they had disobeyed and fallen, God did not want them to take from the tree of life, because that would have formalized fully their status and made it so that potentially he couldn't redeem them. God says, behold, the man has become like one of us, knowing good from evil. Now lest he reach out his hand and take also of the tree of life and eat and live forever. So there's something about this tree, this significance of this tree, that now that in their fallen state it was forbidden. We come across that tree again in Revelations 22, where it says the tree of life with its 12 kinds of fruit, yielding its fruit each month. The leaves of the trees were for the healing of the nations. Now we also then start to read, let's turn over to Genesis chapter 3. We hear God giving the result of their transgression to each of them in turn. And to the man he says, you're going to till the ground and it's going to be thorns. And to the serpent he says, I'm going to put an enmity between you and the woman, and between her offspring and your offspring, and he shall bruise your head and you shall bruise his heel, which is kind of a little bit cryptic for our understanding, but more of that later on. And the woman, he said to her, this is verse 17, Genesis chapter 3, because you have listened to the voice of your wife, he's saying this to Adam, and have eaten the tree which I commanded you, you shall not eat. Cursed is the ground before you all the days of your life. And he says to the woman in verse 16, I will multiply your pain in childbearing, and your desire shall be for your husband. He shall rule over you. So those are the kind of like punishments, if you like, for doing what had just happened. And the main punishment for them was that they were sent out from the presence of God from the garden. But God did not want to just abandon them completely. He made a covenant with them. He killed an animal and he clothed them with the animal skins, and he sent them out of the garden. At this point in time, they didn't realize they were naked. I believe they shone so brightly with the supernatural power and presence of God on them that they didn't actually need clothes. And it was only when they lost that presence and supernatural power that they realized they were naked, and God covered up their nakedness. You know, in the spiritual world, a born-again believer stands out as a shining one, as a light to the other supernatural beings that are around. So don't think that you're quietly hiding away. The spiritual world can see you and know who you are. Before they went out of the garden completely, the woman was promised this glimmer of hope that at some point in the future, the seed of a woman would bruise Satan's head and he would bruise his heel. And Paul references this in Timothy chapter 1, 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 15. And the phrasing there is that she will be saved through childbirth. Let's just read that and just have a few minutes just to explore that statement. 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 15, starting at verse 11 actually. Let a woman learn quietly with all submissiveness. I do not permit a woman to teach or exercise authority over a man. Rather, she is to remain quiet. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. Yet she will be saved through childbearing if they continue in faith and love and holiness with self-control. So for years, over the centuries, the church, that passage has rendered women silent in modern society, in our churches, and possibly throughout all generations. Yet we miss the point that Paul is making here. Perhaps because we don't understand Greek grammar. I don't understand Greek grammar, but I can research and I can learn. So we're not going to give you a grammar lesson right now, but I want to highlight a few key things that will aid you understanding this passage. At first glance, first reading of that passage, you might think that Paul is saying that only women who have children can achieve salvation. And we know that that's not true, because in Romans chapter 10, verse 9 and 10, it clearly outlines the criteria for salvation. Because if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. For with the heart one believes and is justified, and with the mouth one confesses and is saved. So what can Paul mean here when he writes that a woman will be saved by childbirth? And the answer lies in a little Greek punctuation mark. I said we weren't going to do a grammar lesson, but you have to have a little grammar lesson. That's often overlooked in our English translations. And it's one of the most difficult texts to translate, so the theologians and the translators tell us. That missing grammatical point is the word the or a. And when we read that passage again and put that missing grammatical point in, it has a whole different connotation and the context is much easier to understand. I like the Passion Translation of this verse where it says, "Yet salvation will come through a child born by a woman, and woman will be saved through that child." So we know that Jesus, the Christ child, would come through a woman and all humanity would be saved. And that was the promise that God was giving to Eve in Genesis 3:15. If you asked most Christians, why is there so much evil in the world, they will quote the fall of man in this passage. But we're going to go on and have a look at another couple of falls that happened. And we're not even going to get past Genesis 11 before we've completed those 3 falls. So you may have had your curiosity awakened by what I've just shared about that passage in Timothy. But for a deeper dive into what Paul was saying there, you have to wait for the videos on women that I'll do later on. So bless you. Be a blessing. Excuse me. I'm sat under trees and I think I'm getting some pollen in my nose. Be blessed and be a blessing. Amen.